What's going on, 3DMJers? I hope you're feeling fatigued today, because we're going to give you the solution to that. Today we're talking about tapers and how to bring performance not only back to where it was before you were fatigued, but above and beyond it so that you can perform. We're going to be talking primarily in the context of powerlifting to begin. Then we're going to talk about the not only the theory behind tapering for performance, but also the practicalities behind it and what we actually run into with our clients. And then we're going to juxtapose it, compare, contrast with things like deloads, things like intro weeks, and maybe non-conventional tapers when you've got edge cases where you've got someone who is potentially having a specific issue or combined with an injury or is in a unique circumstance, as many of us are these very uncertain times. So anywho, I am joined by my fellow powerlifting coaches, Brad Loomis and Alberto Nunez. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me, Eric.
Yeah, honored to be here. Honored to be here.
You're welcome to your own podcast, yes. I've clearly been doing too many Iron Culture podcasts. So yeah, I think it might be helpful just to first talk about like what the hell is a taper. People throw around deload weeks, unload weeks, light weeks, and tapers. And we have talked about deloads before on the 3DMJ podcast, but we're going to talk about tapers specifically in the context of peaking for a powerlifting meet. And I think like the big difference, folks, is that while we have described deloads as taking like one step back to take, 2 or 3 steps forward, I think more accurately, deloads are hitting pause so that you can keep taking steps forward.
Yeah.
While a taper, you actually are taking a bit of a step back. And one almost universal anecdote that I've seen, at least among powerlifters and strength athletes that run true and semi-aggressive tapers, is that the week after the competition, nothing good happens there, except that you step foot in the gym. So I don't know, is that an anecdote that you guys have seen yourselves or in your athletes?
For sure. Even like sometimes demotivation actually happens to where they don't actually want to step into the gym. That's pretty wrecked when you take something that you love and you actually don't want to do it for about 3-4 days. Yeah, I think that's a sign that you're pretty wrecked.
Absolutely. I don't know if you've seen the same thing, Alberto.
Yeah, even with folks who maybe they left the meet with everyone saying like, man, you could have loaded up more on that bar. Like even when those folks are like, oh, okay, well, this went pretty well, so guess next week's just gonna be back to business. And it's like, no, man, we definitely did a few things right, and that's why it appears that way on the platform. But nevertheless, like, don't discount all the work you did to get yourself up until this point. So yeah, no way around it. It's kind of like it's similar to like the post contest, right? It's like when you're done and you're like recovering and you're coming out of it, it's, like your body looks all gunky and funny a few weeks afterwards. And that's just the reality of the situation. And the more you do it, the more you just kind of know that, okay, that's just how it is. But yeah, it's the norm.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very common anecdote. And the reason why I started with talking about tapers by talking about the period after the taper, which doesn't seem like a logical flow by any means, there's a purpose behind the madness. And that's because this is the part that people get twisted, and you can start to understand the narratives they have around why they think a taper works. And so, for example, there's a lot of people who will say, oh man, like you normally don't do squat, bench, deadlift in the same day. You don't normally go that heavy 9 times. That meet really puts you in the hole. And while that's not an effect, and certainly that is a true statement that that's something you're not accustomed to, and all that heavy loading in the same day, especially like normally, even if you do an SBD day, you're out of there in 2 to 3 hours. Meets last 6 hours. So there's this interspersed thing, like you're basically doing 3 workouts, at least in the time course of what's going on. So you kind of have to stay on for a long period of time. So it's definitely a novel stress. But I think what people are missing is that what's really causing that very shitty feeling in the gym the next week and the poor performance is that a taper, the whole purpose of it is to aggressively reduce the total workload so that you dump fatigue. It's not to create this kind of quote unquote super compensation effect, even though it looks like that, that it's actually enhancing performance. It is allowing you to see your capacity for performance by dumping fatigue. So how do we dump fatigue? Great question. I'm glad you asked. Well, fatigue comes hand in hand with fitness, and fitness is something that we get from training. So if we use the good old handy dual factor model, the fitness and fatigue model, to kind of conceptualize this, there are three factors. There's fitness that you get from training, which is a kind of an abstract concept that you can never fully see. There's fatigue, which is the fatigue from training. And then there's the thing you can see, which is performance, which is essentially your fitness minus your fatigue. The good news is that fatigue dissipates at a faster rate than fitness if you have good training balance. And that's why we actually see getting stronger over time when you're training hard but still training effectively. However, fitness holds on a lot more reliably, and you can go like a week without training, without at all, and you will start to see some very minimal drops in the things that contribute to strength, like muscle size and force production capacity. So the idea is that we try to get the best balance of those two to enhance acute performance. We're doing the least amount of specific training to hold on to as much of the fitness as we can while dumping fatigue. But because it is the fatigue that is literally generating the fitness, we have to disrupt homeostasis to induce an adaptation. We can't completely drop fatigue while maintaining fitness. So what is happening that when you do all this low volume training but just enough specific heavy training is that you maintain the ability to do that heavy training enough to not lose any substantial amounts of fitness. But fatigue drops off sharply, so the net performance increase is higher than it ever is in training, and ideally, you hit some PRs on the platform, but you're now unfit. So when you go back to a regular volume of training, or even reduced volume of training, you feel like trash. So anyway, I know that was a bit of a rant, a bit of a monologue, but I hope that helps people understand what is really going on and why I don't like the term supercompensation and why I don't fully agree with the narrative that it's the meat itself that causes that drop off afterwards. There's a great saying, to put this in really simple terms, that is really just kind of focused on the outcome rather than the mechanism, by Dan John, who I'm a big fan of. And he says, after every peak is a cliff. And I've experienced that, my athletes have, and I know you guys have as well. As a quick application aside, something that I like to do, Brad, because this goes back to what you were talking about. You were saying how if the thing you love, you're not even motivated to do and you're not enjoying while you do it. I think with a self-motivated athlete who is, not in a bad mental state, like if they didn't have a really shitty meet, I think this works especially well, is just to give them a self-guided deload with just a little bit of guardrails for what they do afterwards. Hey, I don't want you to train any more than 3 times this week. Don't take anything heavier than your openers. And then besides that, do whatever you want and don't train to failure. Like if someone was coming in training 5 days a week into that, they'll probably be fine. And you'll find that they'll gravitate towards what they like, right? So if they don't want to even touch the big 3, which is common, they might just do a couple, like 3 upper body days, or something like that. And it's fine because essentially you just want them to get them back into doing something, but not having a bad time in the gym. You don't want to kind of extend that post-contest blues. So I don't know, how do you guys approach that post-meet period?
A lot of times I'll just say, okay, take off till Wednesday. The meet's on Saturday. Do not step in the gym until Wednesday. And usually that's enough to where they want to step in the gym on Wednesday. You know what I mean? But yeah, I do a lot of the same things. I just kind of give them just certain boundaries, nothing over 5 reps, like you said, Eric, nothing heavier than what your openers were. And then outside of that, just, kind of do what it is that you want to do, whatever exercise it is that you want to do, or whatever, call it a split, 3 upper body days, upper, lower, upper, whatever, just those are your constraints. Go have fun. And now a lot of times that'll reignite, what it is that they want to do. And then they're ready to get back at it again.
And I think emphasizing go have fun is a really key important part too, because then they'll self-organize around that as a motivation rather than, I need to get back to like effective training. Which I think that's something you got to have that conversation either with yourself or with your athlete after a meet, because sometimes you're like, I had a little bit left. I want to see if I could hit that the week after. And sometimes I've seen videos of people doing that, high level powerlifters. Sometimes they miss something in a meet and they need to prove it to themselves to get it. I don't necessarily have an issue with that, but I think you just need to also prepare yourself that you might miss it again. and is that worth it? Is that a time point when you want to attempt it? I think that's a case by case answer. But anyway, how about you, Berto?
Similar to both of you guys, probably another thing I'll throw in there sometimes is just like, hey, let's have a week where maybe we only do cardio, just come in, get that lifter's high. You watch everyone out there lifting, kind of makes you want to lift. There's a little bit of FOMO associated with it. So that's probably the one thing I'd add is sometimes just a nice week of nothing but cardio, no loading. Maybe go pick, it's like, hey, go find me 6 or 8, I guess, bodybuilder / accessory movements that you might want to include in this next training block that you seem to enjoy. Go figure that out. Since we'll probably be doing a little bit more of that on the other side of the meet. But yeah, generally speaking, it's been a pretty tense situation probably for the last few weeks. So getting away from that, sometimes it's hard to distinguish how much of the just I guess overall fatigue and stress is like the training, and then how much is just what's going on inside the athlete's head. And I think it's quite a bit because, as an athlete matures and they do this longer and longer, they just get so much more predictable, which to me is a sign that, hey, more or less like the fluctuations and what's going on, it's what's in that spreadsheet as opposed to like the other things that I might not know about and maybe you're not fully aware about just yet. So yeah, having a week, a little vacation, probably like an actual little vacation, probably not a bad thing.
So 2 things. One, I suspect after this podcast launches, we'll be getting no powerlifting clients ever again because you said you just give them a week of only cardio. I personally would fire you on the spot if I got that email. You wouldn't even like ever hear from me again. You would just see a PayPal dispute and nothing else if you did that. No, but in all seriousness, I love that. I like that it kind of you're creating the desire again to lift, which I think is pretty slick. But really, what the other thing I wanted to say is that you're emphasizing that regardless of this whole conceptual theoretical fitness fatigue model, there's a ton of stress that goes into peaking for a meet. And that's even for experienced competitors. I think anyone who cares about what's going to happen on the platform is going to experience that because nerves are directly inverse to how much you care. It's kind of the same thing as grief. Like when someone dies, it feels terrible if we cared about them. And sometimes we just want to get away from it. Like we don't want to feel it. And I think it's important to remind yourself when you're experiencing grief that the grief is the inverse to how much that person meant to you, which is kind of a nice thing to think about when you're in those positions. Similarly, when the nerves are really getting to you and your excitement and your nervousness, it's freaking you out on the platform and you're trying to not care or calm yourself down, that strategy is probably not going to work because you do care, Yeah. So I think sometimes just embracing the fact that, I'm excited about this, that can just kind of normalize that experience, but it doesn't come at no cost. That level of arousal that you're experiencing in some of those sleepless nights and the night before the meet, or you're dreaming about getting on the platform and then realizing that you forgot your knee sleeves or whatever, all the stuff that goes through lifters' heads and what they experience, that comes with stress too, that may not be perfectly expressed by the volume load calculations, in your spreadsheets for sure. And I think that's a really important point, Berto. Thank you. So kind of going back to that analogy I started with of a deload being a stop and then continuing to take steps forward. I really do think a taper is a step backward. And there is actually some data to support this. We mentioned off air, like it's really easy to conceptualize with other types of athletes who use tapers, like endurance athletes. Like their primary variable is their like VO2 max. Basically, how much oxygen can they get in and utilize effectively to maintain, high threshold aerobic performance, and that's going to have a very direct impact on how quickly they're able to complete the race, right? So, the way you get your body better at dealing with and processing oxygen is challenging it. Is trying to run faster or longer at a higher intensity than you previously had. So if the taper means that you're running less or running at a lower intensity or both in some combination, that means we're probably actually seeing an insufficient stimulus to keep getting that. So we're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and we're just taking advantage of having the short-term increase in our bank account, but we're in debt, Like we're paying off a credit card with a credit card. Like the bank account looks good right now, but the phone's going to be ringing pretty soon if you don't pay that check down the track. And the same thing happens in strength sport. A good example is there was a case study of two weightlifters. And I believe this came out of Eastern Tennessee ETSU, which does a lot of sports science, a lot of weightlifting stuff. And the case study basically tracked the lead up to USAW nationals for these weightlifters and tracked a whole bunch of variables. And you can see that their jump height peaked on the day of the competition. And while they didn't necessarily hit PRs on the platform, when you're actually in game day, it comes down to like execution, even more so for weightlifting. What attempts do the people around you make? You're probably fighting for placings, etc. So the fact that on game day, they measured their jump height, which actually is strongly correlated to weightlifting performance, and it was at its highest right around competition, means the taper worked. Their ability to perform, their readiness was at its highest. However, other metrics of things that are related to strength had actually decreased, like cross-sectional area, or either that or muscle thickness, I can't remember the specific measurement, had decreased a little bit in the quadriceps of these individuals. And this is something we've also seen in some case studies that Dr. Zerdos did, looking at like daily 1RM training, which is kind of akin to some of the latter phases of a taper. So we are actually losing ground for our overall goal when we do a taper, because to drop that fatigue, we have to lose some fitness. And I think that is something that is a really good way to differentiate between what a taper is and then what a deload is. Because we're not actually trying to take a step back in a deload. We're trying to basically do the least amount where we don't lose fitness, but we do drop some fatigue. So yeah, I don't know. I find that really interesting. And I think that maybe is just eye-opening for people in the narratives they have around tapering. The idea that I might actually lose some muscle size and I might be a smaller version of myself and have some other adaptations that aren't there when I'm hitting PRs on the platform, I don't know. I don't think that's something I really conceptualized well in, let's say, like 2010 or 11 when I was first competing. How about you guys?
Bert, I'll let you go first. I went first last 2 times.
Okay. So, it's similar to me. I draw comparisons between both sports, and like the tapering is kind of like the peak week. Like with like we used to hold the peak week as like some magical thing that takes place. Like I remember my first show. It's like posting a picture to my friends and family. It's like, wait till you see this in a week. I looked relatively the same, probably a little worse because I shot myself in the foot. But with the powerlifting, the tapers, I personally like to rely on making a lot of our progress like on the front end, or not necessarily the front end, but somewhere along the block. It's like, hey, I want to spend enough time with an athlete, like really charging it up, really, if possible, like somewhere along the way through the meat and potatoes of it all, hitting some PRs, or at least some signs that it's like, hey, that was our second attempt last meet on the bench press. Like now that looks like it could be our last warm up, before we hit the platform. So I like to see the strength gains come way far ahead of time. I think most people who have a reasonable coaching approach, that's how they do things. And when it comes to the taper, it's like realistically, it's like you just want, because shit happens anyways. You just want to ensure that you're in the best possible position to have a really good day, which usually is going to be, in my experience, like a 3, 4, 5% difference from like what you were hitting at your most fatigued. I think in the past, I was a little bit guilty of perhaps trying to really hit that home run, because intuitively I did understand that, okay, like we are going to get a little weaker, but we're going to be fresher, So like I'd say 5, 6, 7 years ago, a lot of my powerlifters would get to the platform probably a little bit more fatigued than they should be. Whereas like now, I'd rather guarantee us being fresh, maybe being half a step slower, but you're quite predictable. Like, because sometimes with those gen of lifters, like what would happen with my folks is that I would see a second attempt and I'm like, okay, based off that second attempt, maybe we can't hit our plan A. We're going to go with the plan B. But then plan C is probably what I should have done in hindsight after they failed their third. So like now it's like, I'd rather get you super strong, like on the front end, get ourselves to the point where we're like for sure going to hit some PRs, even if we have to plan B through the whole thing, and be conservative, and honestly give up, I think, a little bit of fitness for the sake of being fresher. And maybe if I have more experience with you, and so I have more experience not just on the programming side, but there's that coach-athlete relationship where you're just more self-aware, more open to having just discussions outside of like the X's and O's. And we do that for a while and we've been working for a minute. Then I'm a little bit more okay with perhaps like, all right, we're going to gamble a little bit, we're going to go ahead and like throw me another card, even though, 17 on the blackjack. But yeah, I think initially, just like volume metrics with bodybuilding, it's like, hey, or like the calories you set for bodybuilding, it's like start a bit on the conservative side and then like edge yourself closer over time. So yeah, no, I've seen that. And these days, especially with newer athletes, I'd rather be a bit fresher and half a step slower for sure.
Absolutely. I think that's really well said. And I love some of the analogies you use there. And I want to let Brad talk, but I'm going to come back to what you said around your anecdotal observations and how they interestingly match some of the research.
Which is exactly kind of what I was going to get into. Because, I mean, I'll be honest, until about a half an hour ago, I didn't know that you actually shrunk a little bit as you're doing a taper. It kind of makes sense, because I kind of think about, especially like my more seasoned veterans, the late phase intermediates and advanced, we have a great meet, we either placed really well or got a couple of PRs or whatever. Even after a good, call it a recovery week, a good intro to the next block, et cetera. It just sometimes, in some cases, and now that I think about it, there's a kind of a correlation with those more advanced athletes. It sometimes takes us months to kind of get back to where we were, and not just like in 1 rep max attempts, but just even the loads and the RPEs and the volume that we were getting, leading up to the meet, and now it's kind of like I've had that aha moment. The light bulb's turned on. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, now I see why, because you're right. The fitness actually did take a little bit of a dip. And it's hard to get that back again, especially in your experienced athletes. But yeah, I just kind of have gone through that aha moment now.
Yeah, man. Ooh. And Brad, I that's nothing to even be like, oh man, how did I not know this? Because there's so little research on it. Mm-hmm. And it is, and not only that, but I think we might not even see those declines in hypertrophy in quote unquote trained athletes, which is your typical, I've been lifting weights 2 years and I can bench my body weight participants that you see in the research. When we're talking about nationally qualified USAW weightlifters, or the people who are in the daily 1RM study in Zerdos's lab, these are people squatting. I think every participant in that study by Zerdos is squatting over 400 pounds. So we're looking at a more representative population of competitive strength athletes. And like you said, when you are pushing the adaptations you're getting to a level beyond your noob gains and even intermediate gains, those things step back a tick, and that they decay a little bit quicker before that curve starts to then be much more slopey, and you see that decay be much slower, and it requires a higher threshold of training to maintain it. So yeah, I think that's like you were saying, Berto. Like I think it's a good thing to understand that, because then you won't try to have the best of both worlds, because you literally can't. And a lot of the times that gamble will result in just having too much fatigue coming into the meet. And that's how I did it back in the day a lot. I'd be like, well, I'm going to keep some volume on my accessories, because I don't want to lose any size, Yeah. And I wasn't wrong, but it wasn't worth it. It was essentially what I didn't realize. And when you think about the variables that are associated with hypertrophy and the variables that are associated with strength, and then the relationship between strength and hypertrophy, that can give you a little bit of peace of mind. So, for example, we've got this relatively well-established dose-response relationship between the more work you do, the more hypertrophy you get to a point, and you have an individual curve there. So I'm not going to be like 10 sets is right for you. It could be, it might not, whatever. But that same curve is far, far, far flatter for strength. Like the first heavy set you do is going to get you probably 80% of the strength gains as if you did 3 sets, believe it or not, if we're talking about high load training. And there's some really cool research out that I've been a part of that is confirming that even in trained powerlifters. So like heavy top sets do so much. Like the intensity factor is a much stronger predictor. The load on the bar and how close it is to the most you can lift has a much larger impact, especially in the short to moderate term. We're talking 1 to 3 months on your strength. So if you keep that in, these drops in hypertrophy are there, but they just simply don't matter. And to maintain the hypertrophy, you'd be introducing more fatigue, which would reduce your top end strength. So that's kind of the gamble that you have to make if you want to hit the biggest peak you can. And it is a gamble. And I can understand why some people in those scenarios where they know that they might have, like you were saying, Brad, let's say a month or two of depressed training might go, it's not worth it. I'm happy to just hit 2.5 kg PB on 2 of my lifts and not taper as hard because I don't want to take that step backward. And I think like that's some of the calculus that goes into my head sometimes when I'm working with an athlete who has like 3 meets in a year. Like we need to do what's sufficient to keep momentum, give them in a good psychological state, qualify and put them in the position where they need to be at the regional meet. And then at nationals, we got to go balls out. And then we got to get it together again for worlds. And there is some of that dynamic push and pull. And you are making concessions in some of those meets to where you aren't like fully tapering them. Because you got other stuff to do, And I think that's something that you have to be aware of as a coach and as an athlete, so that you're not trying to quote unquote get the best of both worlds or game the system. Because when you do that, you end up shooting yourself in the foot in more cases than not. So that's really good perspective, Brad.
Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez here to tell you that we just launched the Vault VIP membership. You can now get access to every single course we've ever made for just $8.99 per month at 3dmjvault.com. Until recently, you could only purchase 1 course at a time at the full price, which currently can cost up to $63. But now, with this new VIP membership, you can have full access to everything we've ever made for 1 low monthly rate. That means you can watch all the videos and get all the document downloads for courses like the lifting library, transitioning away from tracking, the Godfather's Guide to Posing, our full fat loss Q&A series, and so much more. Again, that's all 12 video courses for only $8.99 a month. Go to 3dmjvault.com, select the VIP membership, and sign yourself up today.
So Berto, as I mentioned, I wanted to go back to what you said, where in your anecdotal observations, you typically see like an effective taper adding like 3, 4, or 5% to their performance from what they had during the hard training. That actually is almost exactly what the very limited data we have on this seems to report. So we've got some data on this, and the man who has done most of it and has collated most of it and reviewed it and done his own research is actually here from New Zealand, and we graduated with our PhDs at the same time. And he is a national level weightlifter and has competed internationally in powerlifting. He's Hayden Pritchard. So he's a multi-time 93 kilo national champ, good friend of mine. And he specifically did his PhD on this. And he's now an RTS coach, which I think is really cool. Because if you know anything about reactive training systems and their emerging strategies protocol, while he developed the literature that kind of gave us our quote unquote stock standard tapering guidelines, emerging strategies is an entirely bottom-up based approach where you chase athlete response. So I know that while he might suggest what the guidelines I'll give as your starting point, I know that RTS doesn't even use traditional tapers in some cases, and in many cases, and for some athletes, it might just be a far more or far less aggressive option than is there, because they are really individualizing it. And I think that's something that everyone should do. So anyway, the research suggests that if you want to get that, say, 3 to 5% performance boost after a hard training phase where you are actually trying to induce those fitness adaptations, you're going to do anywhere between 2/3 to only 1/3 the volume. So it could be up to like a 70% decrease in volume while you're roughly maintaining load, or going down, maybe say 5 to 10%. And that is your average load. And I think it's important to remember that when the studies that look at this, they typically define load or intensity as percentage of 1RM. So the RPE could actually be dropping substantially, or your proximity to failure. So for example, if your average percentage of 1RM in your hard training was 85%, and you go, well, you know what, I'm going to keep it there, but I'm going to reduce my volume. The volume load calculations is what they're looking at. So that could be, I was doing sets of 5 with 80% on this day, and then I was doing triples at 85% on this day. Now you might be doing doubles and singles at those same loads. So those are actually much lower RPEs. And that is typically what I do in my training and with my athletes. I don't necessarily want people in like the last week to be hitting 9 or 10 RPEs. That was for 3 and 2 weeks out at most. The load is still there because I want them to feel a heavy bar, like a heavy load on their back. But typically I'm hitting openers 5 to 7 days out, sometimes 9 days out for the deadlift in some cases. For certain athletes that seem to have a larger recovery time course. And then like the week of, the heaviest thing we're hitting, and it's probably earlier in the week, is maybe like their last warm-up that they would have planned before their first attempt. And then, like I said, accessory volume's going down, back off volume's going way down. And it also follows a true tapered approach. So like there are different types of tapers. There's step tapers, there's exponential tapers. And essentially just means like how sharp is the drop off? And does it look more linear, or does it look more like a sharp curve downward? And I don't think the data is that consistent to say there's one way that's better than another. But to give you an example, like the first day of the week and the actual final week of the taper, you might have one back off set on, let's say, squat and bench and not on deadlift. The next day, and your top sets maybe say like a single at like a 7 RPE. And the next day, there's no back offs and it's just singles at 6. And then the final day, there's singles at 5 and you don't even hit deadlift. And that's kind of that sharp downward curve where most of it is front loaded. So anyway, hopefully that helps people get an idea of what we're actually talking about. Stock standard answer is for 1 to 3 weeks, depending on how long that buildup was. And obviously, if you're doing like a 3 or 2 week taper, it has to be a much more gradual drop off, and it kind of blends in with almost the linear approach where volume's going down as intensity goes up. And you're dropping volume by up to 70%, and you're roughly maintaining or slightly decreasing load. And that is the objective load, percentage of 1RM average. So that means RPE could be quite lower. So anyway, that's what it is on paper. But I'm curious at this stage, I'd love to hear from you guys, Brad and Berto. What do your tapers look like in practice when you guys apply these? Where do you start? And then what things do you decide to change them based on when you see athlete response?
Man, there's a few things to take into consideration. Like, for example, we'll start with how easy someone loses their groove. So like there's some folks that if they don't see a squat for like 3 days, like it's like they completely forgot how to squat. So you have to take that into consideration as well. So that's going to shift where some work goes. Some people, based off how they're put together, like if someone's really put together well, say for like a deadlift. So usually long lower extremities, short torso, long arms. Usually their squat wears them out like big time. Like that is, structurally speaking, that is quite demanding, right? The exact opposite of their deadlift. So with that, you have to take that into consideration too. It's like, okay, so I want us to be structurally fresh for that squat. So if you weigh that in as well, size of the athlete as well. The bigger the athlete, usually, honestly, the more you get from your tapers, at least in my experience, it seems that way. Mm-hmm. Whereas like the smaller athletes, you don't seem to get nearly as much. And with those guys, it's like, yeah, you have to commence the taper a bit earlier. Surprisingly so, in fact. Like there's a huge difference between someone who's, I don't know, like 230, 240 compared to someone who's like, I guess around the size of a typical male at like about 200 pounds or so, like, so, based off that, based off just what we've seen with the training, their preference as well, like what makes them feel comfortable. Yeah. You have to take all those things into consideration. That's, I guess, where the art aspect is. So, yeah, because a lot of it, like, is what you just mentioned. And then it's like, okay, I'm going to kind of take these fundamental rules. That's where most of us start, and then apply them to said person. But yeah, I think the ones that have the biggest impact is, I'd say for sure, probably the size of the athlete and how what lifts like wipe them out like the most. Like for me, a deadlift, I know if I ever decided to like power lift again, it's not something that I lose my neurological groove on a whole lot. But structurally, because I have a very long torso, short little arms, oh man, like does it wreck me? So so yeah, there's a lot of moving parts to it for sure. But those are a few of the major ones that I take into consideration.
Well said. How about you, Brad?
With all that variability in mind, I'm keenly aware of that. And so a lot of times, especially if it's somebody that has done a few meets and it's not like their first meet, and even sometimes with people that are doing their first meet, just to kind of increase my chances for success, I'll sometimes do a couple like practice tapers kind of during deloads, in the actual macro cycle of training leading up to it, and so I'll kind of take a stab in the dark a couple of times and kind of use my experience through those things to increase, my chances of success on the actual meet. And so typically, it's kind of like if I have multiple stabs, the first stab, I'll just say, okay, let's do exactly what you said, Eric. Let's just maintain our loads for the most part and just dramatically drop volume through sets and reps. And we don't have a lot of time here. So when I say dramatic, let's kind of like end a week and then the beginning of the next week. If we're doing, 3 back off sets, we're doing 2 and then 1 and then just our single and then kind of see how we perform, kind of the following week. And sometimes, well, it works sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. That's why I like to kind of do a little bit of practice stabs at these, because sometimes with some people, they don't dissipate fatigue fast enough if we're maintaining that load, call it just your body, is wrecked too much in a non-physical, like non-sore way of putting it.
My man's working so hard to not say CNS fatigue. I love it.
Damn, you know me that good, bro. Huh? But yeah, I mean, it's not enough. It's not enough. And so maybe the second time around, we'll kind of drop off both RPE, drop off load, and, kind of reps, sets, kind of what have you as that taper goes on. And sometimes that will reveal, 1 week is not enough. Maybe we need to do 2 weeks here. Maybe we need to have a more subtle drop off, like you said, that's kind of a little bit more linear as opposed to like this kind of really sharp cliff, what I mean? And sometimes we find out that we need that cliff. We can work right up till the end. And as long as we've got that cliff, fatigue dumps very, very quickly. So, however, with that all being said, I've learned a few things from my fellow coach, Alberto here, taking into consideration size and, taking into consideration, I have a few people that are just stellar deadlifts. And I never thought about, well, you know what, probably the squat's a little bit harder work for those particular people. And maybe I need to be more aggressive tapering that and less aggressive tapering it as what it is that they're good at, So, yeah, that's kind of how I go about, the way that I put all these concepts that you talked about into practice.
I love it. Individual considerations were the big thing we got from you, Berto, and then trial and error and not going into this blind, like you said, Brad. I think those are probably the two most important things that you need to take away from this, is that regardless of what the on paper recommendations are, you have to think about how they apply in the individual case. And then you probably should test them out either with a lightweight version of a taper, kind of semi deload-esque, to see if it does work, and then go, okay, I'll push it a little further. I think that's basically what you were describing, Brad. And maybe not always push it further. Sometimes you're like, oh, it went bad, like, and they felt fresh, if that's the case. But I think just like, a stab in the dark, as you said, at a taper, resulting in someone feeling fresh, but weaker, is not common. Like, oh, we over tapered with our first guess. It's also not common that when we're doing our first trial peak week in bodybuilding, that someone spills over. Most of the time we err on the side of flat, and then we add more carbs. And I think it's a very similar process. Like when I've got a new athlete and I bring them through multiple peak weeks, let's say we got 3 shows. I don't want to overshoot on the first show, because then I don't know how much to pull it back. However, you can, spilled over just kind of looks spilled because you're full. And this is how blurry are you? And I don't know, these are new stage lights, I haven't seen you with color on. So it is very difficult to gauge how much do you need to pull back carbohydrates. However, if you've got all this refeed data, and if you've seen them diet over different stages, and you go, okay, we're going to take 10% more than our refeed and add an extra day in, and we'll see what happens with this backload. And you're like, oh, they still, I think they can get fuller. Next time you might add another, 40 grams of carbs or something like that? That's the type of changes we're talking about. And then the benefit of that too is, okay, let's say the next, that's show 1, and show 2, you add 40 grams of carbs. If show 3, you still think they can get fuller, and you add another 40 and they spill over a little, that's all it'll be. It'll just be a little spillover. Versus if you mess up the first one, you might be pulling back the whole rest of the year and not knowing where to go. So I think the same thing happens when you trial these tapers. It's actually difficult to over taper someone, and if you do want to err on the side of giving them too much of a taper or too little, you probably do want to do too much. So it's kind of one of those things where it shares that similarity to being conservative on a carb load. You want to be relatively semi-aggressive with your tapers if you don't know which way to go. Don't be like I was, the kind of neurotic lifter who wanted to maintain volume because I was afraid of backsliding. Err on the side of taking it pretty serious, and really, really making sure you feel nice and fresh. That is an intimidating experience if you've never done it before, which is why I think what Brad said is so important, is to trial it in training when there's not, meat on the line. So excellent contributions.
And to expand on that too is just kind of observe what happens afterward as well. Just like sometimes our bodybuilders will be like, bro, I had this sick full pump when I ate the cheat meal after the competition. Oh, well, really, send me some pictures. Let's see what we look like. Maybe we can use that information as part of our next peak week. I do
and
that.
Just send me your forearm pictures. That's all I need to see.
Not the ankle. Don't show me the ankle, because.
But yeah, I want to see that, and it's just like with our tapers. How does training go the next week? How does training go the next 5 days? After that, and we can kind of utilize that as kind of a sign of how effective our taper was too. And I like to use sometimes non-conventional lifting ways of doing it. I want you to go into the gym, and I just want you to just jump around. How do you feel? How's coordination feel? How does the amount of power that you generate with your jump, and things like that. Kettlebells are a great way to do that. You can kind of really test out velocities when you're just doing a simple kettlebell swing with sub-maximal load, is just concentrating on velocity, But yeah, just kind of expanding that observation period to what happens after the meet and after the show, et cetera.
No, that's really good. I think, because the only downside to kind of that over taper in a training phase is that then the whole next mesocycle's messed up. I hit some small PRs, but then I was just like, oh man, we took too many steps backward there. So yeah, I think those are all really good considerations. So one of the biggest individual things that I find, I think the most frequent occurrence where I have to deviate from the published Pritchard et al. Papers on tapering are that I sometimes have to drop load way more than 5 or 10%. And that's because, like, I don't know about you guys, but my powerlifters get hurt more often during the build-up phase of the heaviest loads for meets. It's not a regular occurrence, of course, but it happens. Just my last meet in, when was that? That was freaking April
19. Oh, that one. Oh, okay.
Yeah. The one where it ended up going really well, but I was so disappointed going into it. I had a minor pec strain and a minor hamstring strain all within the last 9 days within that window. They weren't on the same day. So going heavy on deadlifts and bench was not an option. So I basically had maybe like 150% of the taper I originally planned with a reduction in load. So it started earlier and I went really light. And it also didn't do this. It went like, so for those listening, it didn't follow a natural gradual taper. It dropped right off to nothing, and then it built up into the meet as I was like going, okay, can I deadlift 140? Oh, I can. Okay, can I deadlift 160? Oh, I can. So the last thing I did was like 4 days out, I deadlifted 210, and my hamstring didn't break, and I went, okay, let's take 3 days off, and we're good, And I was doing the same thing with bench, like, okay, let's try 100, let's try 105, let's try 110. So I was doing things very wrong, but I ended up having quite a good meet because I was having to deal with injury or aches and pains or load-related issues, which I think is a more extreme version of what you were saying, Brad, where I joked you were struggling not to say CNS fatigue. But I mean, honestly, when we're not sore and we just feel like shit and we're not strong, it's totally understandable that, we would describe that as, well, okay, if we know that we have, strength that is generated through neuromuscular adaptations and structural adaptations, okay, it's neuromuscular fatigue, it's CNS fatigue, which I think we all know what we're talking about when we feel that. It doesn't matter if it's technically correct or not, but there are certain times when what we need a deload from, or what we need to taper, is load, whether that is due to pain or just due to that occurrence of I'm just not strong because I'm going heavy, and it's something I've repeatedly seen in my training patterns or in prior meets. So sometimes that I think the most common individual factor that I change is I break that maintain intensity rule by a lot. And sometimes it'll be 2 weeks with basically loads just going down and not touching anything, over like, 85% of 1RM. And I think that's a nerve-wracking time as a coach. And I know it's a nerve-wracking time even more so as an athlete. But that has been successful on multiple occaans. So I don't know if that's something that you guys have observed or had to do, or how you manage that.
Yeah, I think it's the card that is pulled the most often. And what helps, so when I have to do that, what I help the athlete with in regards to, framing the situation is that what's going to save our butts is the fact that I think now more than ever, like those squat every day Bulgarian methods, like they had something right in regards to like the practice that you get from that, right? And it's super common now that most powerlifters spend a good chunk of the year hitting, top singles at like 7-8 RPE throughout, certain legs of a training block. So it's like, hey, look at all the practice we've done. Like 4 or 5 years ago, that just wasn't common. So we've discussed on other podcasts why that's been just one of the greater additions in the last few years, like to powerlifting, something that that has, I think, just really helped experienced athletes, helped newer athletes, whole lot of benefits. But that's one, is that like if you do find yourself in trouble where you can't use the intensity that you want to use during this like super important phase where, yeah, intensity is kind of what you're writing. It's like, hey, like that, all that practice we had before, it's like not erased. Like you still remember that. So yeah, you were saying, Brad?
Well, I was just going to say that oftentimes when something like that happens, I'm not even really thinking of tapering or the most effective way to taper. I'm just thinking, let's get this athlete healthy so they can actually compete, because that has happened on occasion, and it's like, okay, at this point, scrap the plan, let's just get you deadlifting something that you can do. And let's just kind of do that in some, repeatable fashion so that we can get you healed, because we know that, all of that fitness that we have developed is not just going to go away, or at least it's going to take a long time for it to go away. So let's just get you healthy so that we can at least get what we know that we worked for up until that point. And yeah, it's kind of one of those things where you're now revealing to me kind of almost an alternative way and a less scary way of dealing with an injury, or like you've just, totally burnt this athlete out, and now you need to kind of dig yourself out of the hole that you've dug yourself into, So yeah, that's all good ammunition for the next time something like that happens.
And ironically, I think that puts the coach and the athlete into a better narrative place than like, I can't tell you how many times I've had athletes who are like, hey, can we preserve a little more volume here? Can we add a set of 5? And I'll do it because I think that additional fatigue that I'm introducing is worth them having that mental calmness of not thinking I'm not doing enough. So it's the net win. But once you're hurt, you go into patch the hole in the boat mode. You're acknowledging this is not a good ideal scenario, so we're trying to salvage the best case scenario, which is or the best case scenario you can get out of that situation, which is similar to the idea of going into a taper knowing that you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, that this is a gimme and a gotcha, and that we're trying to get the best out of this compromise. So that was exactly what I experienced. Is I went into the meet with very low expectations, thinking things are going to go terribly, and I somehow walked away with a PR total and a PR deadlift. And enough in the tank where I knew I could have hit a PR on the squat, but I didn't want to be aggressive because I just tore my hamstring. So it was an interesting, enlightening experience where I really got to see that firsthand. And I think I've had the same thing with Bryce. He's had some good meets where he had like a strained lower back going into it that we're trying to recover from, and we had a longer period of hitting lower loads than I initially programmed. And then lo and behold, the guy medals at Worlds. So it's one of those things that I think enough people have experienced it where it's not the end of the world, so long as it's not a serious injury. If it's just one of those aches and pains that often come from lifting heavy and you're like, oh shit, the timing couldn't be worse. I'll be good in 2 weeks, but I don't have 2 weeks, So instead of training around this, I really need to take an aggressive taper and keep your head up, I guess is the message there. We've got enough times where we've seen that go better than you might expect. Another individual factor, and you brought this up earlier, Berto, is that while I normally start with kind of a similar, my default maybe still has something different for bench, but I approach the lifts a little differently. So I've had the unique opportunity to work with a couple bench-only athletes now. So my wife, Barb, loves benching, hates squatting, and actually did a bench-only meet, and she now holds... she's got a regional record in her age class for the bench press. And she's not the only bench-only athlete I've worked with, but tapers just seem to do like almost nothing for bench press. I've experienced that pretty consistently, that my expectations when I coach and for myself around bench press is I might hit 2.5 more than my best lift in training, but only if that best lift in training was a 9.5, So it's basically, I'll get back to where I was. And if I try to taper, sometimes I even get worse. That's not necessarily, that's me, but it's not all my athletes. So I pretty much just treat bench press like I'm training, like it's a deload, Like I think in my week, okay, I have a hard day on day 1 on bench. I have an easy day on day 2. I have a hard day on day 3. Then I have 2 days off before I bench, and normally I have a good bench day. And that's kind of how I treat my taper, just slightly more aggressive, right? However, for squat and deadlift, I do kind of follow that pattern we talked about before. And then sometimes, like you talked about, Berto, certain athletes get more beat up by squat, certain athletes get more beat up by deadlift. And I find that what I end up falling on is this dissimilar pattern of when the taper starts and how aggressive they are for each of the lifts. So like, for example, Bryce deloads his deadlift in the session before he starts deloading his squat and bench. So he practices his openers on deadlift on like day 4 of his 5-day training split, and then squat and bench on day 5. And then he maintains a little more volume on squat and bench than he does on deadlift. For myself, I typically start deloading deadlift and squat on the same day, maybe deadlift it one day earlier, but it's not like a necessity or something I've consistently seen better. And then I pretty much just keep training bench pretty hard all the way up until I'm like 3 days out. So that's just another really, really common thing. So those are like probably the two most common anecdotes that come up is we might have to deload load because you get some ouchie, or don't expect all of the big three to follow the same pattern of deloading. So in fact, I'd probably say that those are almost as common as the quote unquote typical pattern in my athletes. I don't know about you too.
I'd say the deadlift is kind of the one that tells me how well I nailed the peak globally. Because it is the one where I almost do expect a 5%.
Yeah.
Come meet day. That's probably the one that tells me, I mean, this is something that, I even noticed like way before there was any structure to my training. Like I knew that unlike other lifts, like if I felt like garbage coming into the gym, like 5-7 years into training, I was not going to, and deadlifts were scheduled, it just was not going to be a good day. That's just usually how it went, like depending on how beat up your C-ness was. That's I have to
Not
throw
a
that
bad
in
word,
at some
but it's a
point.
bad word.
The C-ness, my C-ness. So the deadlift, I think, is the one that, there's obviously other things that factor in, but, at the end is the one I look at and I'm like, okay, depending on how that went, tells me if, I negotiated well with the whole fitness fatigue model, if we nailed it more or less. Just a lot of things about the nature of the lift. It's the last one of the day as well. So by the time you get to deadlifts, it's like you're pretty cooked. I'd say the deadlift is probably the one where generally it's the one you taper most assertively. And it's the one that it's one of the ways I guess I measure success outside of other things that can happen.
Yeah.
Deadlift.
It's also the one you let fly
usually
on the third attempt more often than the others, right?
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you might
Absolutely.
be jockeying for position, or you realize that you had more after squats, So, yeah.
Oh, is it
What
my
about you,
turn?
Bradley? It is your turn, Bradley.
Gosh, I can't remember what we were talking about, but what I was going to say, which maybe answers the question or it doesn't. Skill involved, I've noticed, has a lot to do with how not only I taper, but then also performance, on any given day. A good example is I've got a couple of athletes that are just phenomenal deadlifters, and they're really freaking good at it. And it's kind of like one of those things where you can kind of tell when somebody's really good at something because their warm-ups look just like their 1RMs. It's just the speed is different. You know what I mean? They're really that good at doing it. And so I've noticed a lot of times I can be like really aggressive with tapers if there's a lot of skill involved and they're really good at doing something. One athlete that comes to mind, if I'd followed a traditional taper like we were just talking about, it really didn't. It was kind of like your bench press with barb. It really didn't do much. They kind of got out of it what they get out of a good day of training. And if with a little bit more of aggressive taper, I've noticed that, okay, we can just deadlift like 4 days prior to the meet and then be done with that, and then taper the other two lifts kind of more traditionally,
Yep.
And then they end up just for whatever reason, just pulling something out of their butt, for lack of a better term. And they get this phenomenal PR, on meet day, or, it's something like they got it, but it was like on legally, they didn't get it. There was like 2 red lights and a white light, or like with me, I fell over backwards after I completed the lift, on a new PR at Nationals one year, so we didn't get the lift, on the meet paper, but we actually got it, and so yep. I always like to take those things into consideration when I am evaluating, how effective a taper was.
Let's not forget the meet you did where you passed out, but you still got the down command and you completed the lift. That's still the most impressive one,
Yes.
He delayed being unconscious until he got his third deadlift.
Yeah. And ironically, that was kind of because I consider myself to be pretty darn good at deadlifting as well. Enough to where I know exactly what I did wrong, if I did miss, a lift. And that was one of those meets where I don't think I deadlifted for 3 days, prior to that meet. And that was a PR, So that was kind of the thing I was thinking of was kind of thinking about what are they good at, and in addition to, kind of the other things that we were talking about, and how much do you actually get out of a taper, because I've noticed kind of the same thing. I'll a lot of times treat the week before a meet with something that it's just so predictable and consistent. I'll just treat it like a regular training week, or like you said, Eric, like a regular deload,
Yeah.
and we end up getting kind of a mini effect of what it was that we were after.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm the opposite of you. My deadlift is where I typically am a 2 white lighter or sometimes a 1 white lighter if I miss it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just not. I don't know if I'm just not good at it or I'm not built well for it or both. But yeah, for me to throw a Hail Mary on a deadlift, I have to know I have reserve enough to where I can overcome the technical issues at lockout that I struggle with. Mm-hmm. But my squat, I'm very confident going for things that are edge cases because I know I can get stuck and even stop moving sometimes, at least it appears that way, and keep going and not lose position. So I think that's absolutely something you need to consider. And that may be why bench press is not that responsive to some degree, because we're looking at a smaller absolute number, so a smaller total increase.
Mm-hmm.
So especially in smaller athletes, you're talking about the difference a taper could even make if it's 3% is a 2.5 kilo jump at most. And depending on the athlete, sometimes the bench is very technical. And not that I mean the bench press is a hard movement, but it can be very go or no go if you're not in the right groove. Like if I don't start pushing backwards when it comes off my chest and it's a 9.5, it is now a 10.5. Mm-hmm. We're done, So I think that's something to consider. So those are the technical skill and difficulties that someone faces at high loads. I think is a really, really important one. Thank you, Brad.
It's funny, the bench press thing reminds me of, I think it was USAPO Nationals 2018, and Joey Flex, he, like per usual has like all these athletes, and it was one of the lighter weight classes with his girls, and he's like, this is like a break for me because he's like, it's like it's 2.5 up or repeat the same weight. That's just all you have.
The strong gals in the lowest weight classes, the 5 kilo jump from first to second, and a 2.5 will repeat on the second to third every time.
Yeah. There's no plan B, right? Plan B is repeat the lift. But yeah, you guys are making me want to power lift again, or at least do the squat thing one more time. Because you're about to get the team record here, Eric, pretty soon here. I mean, that's what it's looking like.
I'm hoping, because I think when you squatted 500, it was actually 500 pounds, right? Because we were using pound plates.
Exactly, yeah.
So the only increments I can do would be 225 or 227 or 230. So if I go for 227 on my third attempt tomorrow, it'll be 501. So I will officially be. I'll have pulled the half Thor to your Eddie if things go well and beat you by a kilo. So yeah.
Yeah, man. One thing.
By the way, if my one arms tomorrow go terribly, you should ignore everything about this podcast because I clearly don't know what I'm talking about.
No, your bench press, especially of late, is looking just fantastic.
Thanks, dude.
Yeah. But like a lot of our folks are primarily bodybuilders, so they hear something like this, and like to me, it's always like it's just you get so much from looking, like this is one of the few times we're looking, on the other side of the fence, like you could benefit from it. Like I think any natural bodybuilder, like if you go back through your history, anytime you've made the most strength gains, right? Like there was an obvious difference in like that area and its prime movers. Like that's just how it goes. It's just like if you're not getting stronger, typically, hey, bro, unless there's some something else was up, which is hardly ever the case. Like really bad form is probably the one thing I can think of. They were quarter squatting or something, but typically, when you were making the most strength gains is when you saw the most changes in your physique. So to me, it's like, hey, take a look at what these powerlifters are doing because like, hey, if you're that dude with a sunken in chest, you have these really good arms, really good delts, but like this is just, it looks like two little chicken McNuggets up there. It's like, like try a bench specialization block, like see what might come out of that. And so yeah, I think it's just how a lot of powerlifters, it's like, hey, you know what, bro? It's like you're really strong on the squat, but I can't believe you squat that on those legs, dude. Like, a leg press might benefit you, every once in a while. The same thing can be said for a lot of bodybuilders. It's like, play with one lift. Like that's what I will do every once in a while with my squat. And afterwards it really does help out like all my bodybuilding specific training.
Yeah, I think there's other ways to echo that same sentiment, that even if you never run a taper and then test your three 1RMs, just as a bodybuilder, understanding the concepts of fitness fatigue and performance can bring a whole new perspective and a more efficient program writing experience to you with how you program your deloads, how far you take them, what you do. Maybe you understand why when you run traditional deloads, they don't go well. Maybe you were being too aggressive or not aggressive enough, and why it always seems to go better if you just take a week off or something like that. I think, learning the whys behind it make it so sometimes we just chase outcomes, but if you can understand why something's happening, then they give you more tools to manipulate that to your advantage down the track. So yeah, even if you're not trying to improve your 1RM, if you're focused on the idea that improving your strength in whatever rep range you want to train in, and focusing on a specific lift so you can get good at it, so you can provide a stimulus, and having objective markers of improving your performance, those are things to definitely take from the powerlifting world. And as someone who has been active and dabbled in a lot of different strength communities, even when I'm not, say, doing a single snatch or clean and jerk in my program, or I'm not doing a single competition squat, bench, or deadlift, those experiences have greatly benefited the way I train and the insights I can take from it, so that I can make better decisions in the long run. So there's a lot of benefit to the mental game of cross training. So I'm glad you brought that up, Berto, because I think some people would be remiss in making the decision of, I'm going to skip this one because, I'm all about winning those hypertrophies and I don't care about my sinus. So, yeah. So, yeah. So don't worry. You can put your sinus away instead of whipping that out and just carry on with your hypertrophies, but you will still benefit from this conversation.
Yeah. And you know where it really comes in handy? It's when you're prepping, because your body is so transparent. Yeah. And like I was always like, I think after my first prep, I was like, I'm just gonna be I'm not one of those guys that holds on to strength when they prep. I'm just one of those dudes, and because I'm trying really hard here and it's obviously not working. But now that I understand that better, and it's I use a lot of what I've learned from powerlifting and managing fatigue to help out my bodybuilders, and now it's to the point where quite often towards the end of the prep is like, could we stop being so damn strong? Because right now is not the time. Like if anything, let's just, doesn't take as much to maintain muscle as it takes to build it. That's what I have to remind them of.
Do you guys remember how much my bench used to fall off in the like my back in the day bodybuilding preps?
Your preps, yeah.
Yeah, shoot, I remember hitting 245 for 10 in the off season before my 2011 prep, and then hitting 245. I'm not going to tell you how many reps, but let's say it wasn't plural. At like the very, very tail end of prep. And dude, the stark contrast to 2019, where I was putting up 315 or 142, 143, all the way up until May and June even, it kind of blew my mind a little bit. And all I was really doing is I was like keeping in some singles, and so here's what I did wrong before, because you're probably wondering what's the difference. What I did wrong before is I didn't want to accept that I was getting weaker at all. So my thing was, well, I'll just train at RPE 10 so I can still put heavy loads. Like there's always going to be 2 skillets on that bar. It doesn't matter what, because I'm, So I ended up making no downward adjustments whatsoever. So I was always fatigued. And there was really no variation in my training. And then as it's really started to go down, I was like, fuck it, I'm just going to do other movements like dumbbells and incline. So like every wrong emotional based adjustment at every turn. So it was just basically me tripping on my own feet for, 6 months of bench press training. But yeah, I think I finally dipped down to like 300 pounds at the very, very end of prep, but I was like 175 like on my low days. So that's I think I'm still relatively stronger than when I was in the off season, or at least similar. But yeah, I was actually really, really surprised by just applying some of these concepts and understanding fitness and fatigue and having my programming be a little more flexible. And knowing what data I was looking at really helped me in my 2019 prep for holding on to that for sure.
Well, and I think it transferred over very well into the bodybuilding side too, because it seemed like you did a very good job of holding on to your muscle. And so kind of keeping the variables of variation in your volume, and kind of maintaining performance kind of transferred over into how it looked on your physique, Cause yeah, I mean, that was, in my opinion, it was clear that was the best package ever, that Eric Helms has ever put up there, And so I think that it's a pretty good, correlation there.
Yeah. I mean, certainly 8 years off didn't hurt. But yeah,
good point.
But no, it wasn't just that I built more muscle, lost the same amount, and then came in a little bit better. I really do think that I had a pretty good job preserving it, especially considering how hard we went at certain phases. And Berto can confirm that. He's here because he saw all the dirty details on a regular basis. So yeah, I think you're right, and I do think I credit a lot of the experimentation I did in the off season prior to that prep, seeing what types of training gave me that best balance between fitness and fatigue. So it really comes down to that core central concept for all you physique athletes listening, is if you understand why you are stronger sometimes, why your performance is better at sometimes, why when maybe you're putting in a lot of really good work to get better, you're not seeing those dividends immediately, but then you do, say, after a vacation or after a few days off or whatever. That can help you kind of unravel this and hopefully have more productive training in the long run. Well, shoot. I feel like we covered a lot of ground. That was a really good conversation. Is there anything that you guys want to touch on that we don't feel like we covered as far as tapers, Brad or Berto?
I mean, the only thing that I would have to say is if you're at all curious now what the difference is between tapering and deload, just listen to some of those other podcasts that we've got up on deloads, because I think that the differences will be pretty clear, once you kind of understand that. So yeah, I don't know if we want to leave that there, if we want to just scratch the surface, of kind of those differences, or if we already have maybe.
Yeah, I think we did a pretty good job. Yeah. So like the standard thing I do with deloads is I basically I drop the RPEs maybe like 1 point or so across the board. And then I generally drop volume by like a set reduction of 1 or 2 from everywhere. Like one set if you're doing a moderate amount of volume. If you're doing high volume, and maybe like 2 sets per movement. And that typically, like if you think about it, if you're doing 3 sets and you drop 1 set, you're doing 2/3 of the volume. So it's basically the least aggressive version of the taper that we were talking about earlier. So it still kind of lines up with what could work as that. So that's a good thing to add, Brad. And yeah, definitely, I would encourage everyone, and I'm sure we'll have it in the show notes, to check out the deload podcast that we had previously. That'll be a really good sister companion to this, as well as if you want to cross-pollinate and get even more of me, we had Hayden Pritchard on the Iron Culture podcast, and we talked to him a lot about tapering, which was pretty cool, and it even extended into the discussion of weightlifting. If for any of you folks who might happen to be putting your bars over your head. Hey, nobody got the shoulder flexion for that on this podcast, but hey, if you want to check it out, except for our producer who is here quietly in the background. So anywho, yeah, there's lots of stuff to accompany this. As always, we really appreciate you listening in, and we look forward to catching you next time.